Why did you choose World War IV?
Because that's what the BBSs I were calling in the local area were running. You know, they were running that, and it was freely downloadable, and it wasn't too hard to get the source code. Because the kind of modifications I wanted to make. Well, initially I was really afraid of the source code because I didn't really know how to program, anything but BASIC, and I really hadn't done that in years either. But after I got into the source code, I realized all the areas of improvement that it needed, and it wasn't too long before I decided to write my own.
So instead of just patching it, perhaps you decided that you just wanted to start over?
Well, I did patch it. I did quite a bit of modifications to WWIV. I made it multi-node compatible. I added support for bidirectional file transfers. I put in multi-node chat. And for a good year, maybe year and a half, I was like the only multi-node WWIV out there, and people would constantly hound me for my modifications. They'd ask me, "Oh, give me this and give me that." It was too difficult to just separate my modifications. And plus I knew all the problems. There was these theoretical problems with, too many people on would crash the database because it wasn't designed for multiple simultaneous user access. So I didn't feel that good about it because it was built on a flimsy deck of cards to begin with. So I didn't give out my modifications to WWIV, and that's when I just decided to start from scratch. It'd be much easier.
But that almost went into rewriting it from scratch, essentially, in order to effectively use that, and I just didn't have the motivation for that. I guess that's somewhat why it kind of stopped. Most of the significant things would have been way too much effort or basically redesigning. Once you get the code base was pretty bad at that point. It would have, if I knew where it was going to be and had designed that stuff in from the start, it would have been a lot better.
Back then and or now, what was your opinion of the World War IV source code?
The source code
Yeah.
is pathetic. It's some of the worst C code I've ever seen in my life. And, at the time, it was the first C code I'd ever seen in my life. So I didn't know any different. When I first, looked at it, I didn't understand, what I was looking at. And the first modification I made didn't compile, and I had no idea why. But from then on, as I learned more about the programming language and got into programming my own projects, I realized just how bad the source code was.
Now, what was pathetic about the source code, I assume, was the obfuscation. Was the flow? Did the flow make sense? Did other parts of it make sense to you?
No, not really. Yeah, there were very few comments. The names of variables and functions were almost purposely. It almost seemed like they were purposely misleading. It was like they had functions like do it and do it one, and do it two. You're like, what is this? Do what? And variable names like x1 and ii2. They make no sense. So it's very difficult to read to begin with. And then when you actually follow the logic, no, it was a real challenge. It was definitely not something that could be considered of professional quality.
I discussed your code with Rob of Synchronet.
Okay.
He indicated there were a lot of variables like x1.
Yes, I still do that a lot. You look at files on the system, if you see an XX, YY, ZZ files, it's probably me that created them. I ended up with, I'm very unoriginal with how to name things. It's just, a temporary variable.
So but one side effect of that is it's much harder for an outsider to trace.
Figure out what's going on, yeah.
Is that on purpose or just?
No, that's just run out of ideas for you have a loop counter. What am I going to call it loop counter or call it X1?
So,
a lot of it is I mean, it seems fairly obvious to me, I guess. But then again, I'm the one who wrote it. Originally, it wasn't so much designed to have other people make significant mods to it, but that's how it ended up. So it wasn't really written with the intent of having other people significantly understand it.
As I understood it, the comments were somewhat sparse.
Yes, uh-huh.
So, I mean, but on the other hand, I suppose that just made it
More of a challenge, yeah.
more of a challenge for the kids to learn how to program. Did you end up going into programming as a vocation?
Yeah, uh-huh. Still am programming.
So why do you think it becomes so popular?
Because it was the only BBS software with free source code. Or not free, obviously. It's not supposed to be free. But it was the only BBS software where the source code was available, and it was, somewhat feature rich. When I first started with WWIV, I was not a programmer, or at least certainly not a C programmer. And so to start with something from scratch to begin with, I wouldn't have no interest. I wouldn't even know where to begin. So I certainly learned some things from looking at the C code originally. Just learned, what a printf does. Unfortunately, I had to unlearn many of the things I learned from looking at the C code because it was so bad. But at least it was something to start with. It wasn't too difficult to add the things I wanted to do without having to worry about all the other basics that had already been taken care of, the serial communications and displaying colors or whatever the issues were. So it's a lot easier to start with something that's already there. Of course, when you get serious about it, that's when you have to deal with the limitations of the original design. But I can understand, people wanting to modify source code. Luckily now, or certainly even with other BBS packages at the time, you could do very high levels of modification without needing the source code. Certainly scripted BBSs, where you have access to the script source code, or you can write your own scripts. You could do, as much or more with those BBS packages that you could have done with WWIV with access to the source code.
Mm-hmm. What's your memories of World War IV.net?
Well, I never really I was never part of World War IV.net proper. The only time I used WWIVnet technology was when we originally formed WWNet, and it was just a small network of, 4 or 5 or 6 BBSs, and we were all running WWIV, so that's why we used that technology. But we didn't actually join the WWIV, the World War IV.net. I still call it WWIV.
No, why not use World War IV.net and be a part of it?
Oh, well, just because we were kind of underground, and that was kind of, joining the mainstream type thing, and we were all running pirated copies of WWIV. None of us had paid for WWIV or the source code, so we certainly didn't want anybody, talking about our modifications to the source code on WWIVnet. That'd be kind of a blow it.
I call it WWIV, and I did for a long time. It actually wasn't until I started the documentary that I knew that it stood for World War IV.
Yeah.
It just didn't hit me. To a man, most of the people I talk to call it WIV.
Yeah, I had heard someone here and there refer to it as World War IV, and I'm like, that can't be what it stands for. That's just too dumb.
So you were hoping that some other name was going to come out of it?
I had no idea what it stood for, but I just knew it couldn't be World War IV because there had never been a World War III. Why would you jump into World War IV?
Well, it was my original BBS before it was any software that anyone else used. Was I think I put on, this was way back Apple, where there were 40-column screens that most of the people had, and so it was World War III I had, but that didn't center quite right on the screen, and so I changed it to World War IV, which centered correctly on the screen.
So you've always pronounced it World War IV?
Mm-hmm. WWIV.
Okay. One thing I found talking to the amount of people I've talked to is that many of them call it simply WIV.
Okay, I've never called it that. I don't think most of the people I talked to had either.
Okay.
So it was originally spelled out World War IV, and that was the login screen to my original interpreted basic BBS. And that software and whatever grew on after it just inherited the name pretty much.
Was there a reason behind calling it World War IV?
Or three, what I had started with was, I'm not sure. You had to have something. That's what ended up coming to my mind first, I guess.
By the time I had realized that WWIV had its limitations and that they weren't going to be solved anytime soon by Wayne Bell or anybody else, I knew that I needed the source code to whatever I was going to be working on. And, really I had a strong interest in creating it myself because, I was learning to program and I already knew a lot of the things that were just done so terribly wrong in WWIV that I was anxious to, create something from scratch correctly. Since World War IV was what I really knew and used, that's pretty much what I mimicked as far as when it came to a user interface. Originally all the commands were mimicked exactly what the current version of World War IV had at the time, or the version that I was running. I was also concerned with switching users over. I didn't want to relearn all new commands, and I certainly didn't want my users to all relearn all new commands. And so initially, all the commands were identical, and they were hard-coded just like WWIV. They weren't something you could change without modifying the source code. That did change over time. But, also, as I'd use it, I had users, actually I had a co-sysop that was very active in it. And he would, ask me, pointed questions like, well, why is it A to auto-reply to an email, but it's not A to auto-reply to posted message, for example, inconsistencies like that. And I'd be like, well, I don't know. That's just the way it is in WWIV. Well, why don't you change that? Why don't you fix that? So, I did make small changes like that. Things that were just kind of silly, like the // commands, I changed those kinds of things. So, I wasn't strictly adhering to the WWIV user interface. Over time, I made improvements where I saw them, where it needed improvement. And eventually, Synchronet would support any user interface. WWIV just happened to be, the original inspiration.
Most of it, at least like at the main menus, was one key commands to start with.
Right.
So you just press them. You have to type / in order to type more than one.
Okay, so you did have...
It would be one key, or if it's /, then you could enter a second one that would be like O would be log out, or /O would be log out without showing me confirming or anything. And longer commands, or you'd be // and then you'd be able to type in the whole word.
It was a little bit late. I think, had I come out, 4 or 5 years earlier, the name would certainly have been known a lot more, and there would be a lot fewer people running WWIV or these other BBS packages at the time.
So it's more of a phase rather than something we should idolize forever, I think.